One. The Fantasy Fullback Dive is continuing our 2020 Fantasy Wolves series and beyond. Thrilled to welcome on for the first time the Ringer's Danny Kelly at Danny B. Kelly. He writes fantasy football, just covers the NFL in general, and also the draft while co-hosting the the Ringer Fantasy Football Show. Used to be the Danasy Show, which I loved, but more SEO friendly, I'd say now. Still will be the Danasy Show is in my heart, man. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. Yeah, we're still the Dynasty Show in our hearts too. It's just we want people to find the podcast, and when you search Dynasty podcast, it just autocorrects to fantasy, so that's not like ideal.
Not ideal at all. But still, as it's always been a great show. So we're going to today cover, of course, the 2020 fantasy football bounce back candidates, guys who didn't really live up to expectations last season, and kind of determine how confident we are doubling down on those guys, going back to the well. When done correctly, I mean, we saw it last year. Dalvin Cook, Aaron Jones, Cooper Kupp, Allen Robinson, all really rebounded nicely in 2019. So it can be key to a victory, but you got to pick the right ones. So we'll look at those players that had some down years and then figure out, are we going back in? And, of course, you can find all these show notes for this and all the interviews at ffbdpod.com. Be sure to check out, again, the Ringer Fantasy Football Show. Recently, some great episodes, an awesome RB preview, top sleepers, draft day targets, just so much since it's been released. So make sure everybody listening, check it out. But before we do with every featured topic, again, those bounce backs, like I do with all the Wolves, I love to pick their brain and just kind of preview and share some of their recent must-see content, which brings me to your guys' draft guide. It's fantastic, absolutely phenomenal. You got all your targets, rankings, a mock draft with some of the GOATs in the industry. And it's so user-friendly too. You click on a player and a little note pops up on them. And best part, it's 100% free. So, I mean, great content, no price. A no-brainer in my mind. Is there anything else that you want to add about that draft guide? It's fantastic.
Yeah, I would just say that, first of all, I appreciate that. And then, I would just add, if people who have seen either the NFL draft guide at the Ringer or the NBA draft guide at the Ringer, we have some really great people who do the user experience for us, and they put it all together. It's just really, really cool. So I'm really proud to just get to put my content on that, because it's like the coolest little platform you could imagine. It just works really well. It works really well on mobile too. So I would just say, if you've seen those before, then you kind of know what you're getting into. It's just a really cool platform, really easy to navigate, and
Absolutely. Very, very user-friendly experience. And I love how you just click on a player and it gives you, if you want just the bottom line, you can get just the one word, 3-word summary, and then you can really dig in if you want more. And just like your draft guide too, you can kind of really customize it to what are you looking for that day? How much information do you want at once? It is so user-friendly and just caters to your learning preference and style all at once. So I really do love it. As I always kind of start out with this, like picking the Wolf's brain process, I just love to know, what was your path into this fantasy industry? When did you get involved? How did you get involved? And do you have any advice for others looking to break into this space?
Yeah, I got involved. I think I've been doing fantasy for the Ringer for about 3.5 years now. Just started out kind of just, the tip of the iceberg stuff, just real basic stuff. And then they've kind of like built me up over the last couple of years and let me do more of it. I really enjoy it. It's kind of been fun to find my niche. I've been doing general NFL for them since I started, but then they've kind of let me get more into the draft and fantasy, which has just been really fun. So, my path to fantasy was just kind of asking if I could do more, and kind of just, them realizing that it was a really good opportunity for the Ringer to have more fantasy content. So, been playing fantasy forever, but started out my career mostly just writing about the NFL in general and X's and O's and things like that. I got into the industry writing about the Seattle Seahawks for SB Nation. So I did that for about 5 years, and then did NFL wide stuff for SB Nation as well for a couple of years before getting a job at the Ringer. And I've just been at the Ringer since basically it started. So about 4 years now, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously the Ringer, a fantastic site. Did you just kind of build that body of work and just, send it over and hope for the best as they release, like, we're looking for writers, or how did you kind of get the attention of them?
I just feel really lucky. I guess they knew who I was somehow.
Yeah.
and they reached out to me actually when they
Oh,
were first
awesome.
starting. So yeah, I was really, really just, I feel lucky for having that opportunity. It was, yeah, I dabbled in pretty much everything. I did draft stuff. I did X's and O's. I was also running the Seahawks blog. So I got to experience like a lot of the different sides of sort of like the different niches, I guess, in the football world. So,
Yeah.
and did some podcasting for SB Nation back in the day. I did some podcasting with Stephen White and PFT commenter before he
Yeah.
went over to Barstool. So that's kind of just this random little tidbit, but yeah, I would say for people looking to break into any of the sports world, just be willing to do whatever. I did blogging, we did a Seattle specific website for like a year where we were covering all the different sports in Seattle. Basically just, this is like a cliche, I guess, but just write as much as you can, because the more reps you get, like the better you get at it. I'd say the same for podcasting. Just get as many reps in as you can, practice, and it becomes like more second nature. But you become more comfortable doing it. And I would say, you can't really replace reps, really.
Exactly. As with anything in life, but yeah, the more and more at bats you get, the better your swings are going to be. Absolutely. What about your process? You said you've been playing fantasy for a while. Are there any routines ever since you started, or whether you've, acquired new routines and best practices that you kind of start with every season when you're developing your rankings, evaluations, just getting started every year?
I don't have like a specific process where I'm going through like a checklist or anything, but I think for me, the biggest thing is reading as much as possible and listening to as many podcasts. Like podcasts you can learn a lot from, I feel like.
Yeah.
And you can turn up the speed to 1.5 and kind of get through like podcasts a little bit faster. I just try and soak up as much information from different analysts around the game, just to get different perspectives, because you get stuck. I always find that I get stuck with biases on players, and I end up sort of just ignoring certain players, and that sometimes can cost you. Sometimes it's good to just follow your gut, but I like to try and soak up as much information as possible, read a lot from beat writers because they really know their teams, and they have a good idea of who's going to get the most volume and things like that. So my process really is just consuming as much information as I can for the season from people that are, trustworthy and know what they're talking about, because that just gives you more ammunition to make your decisions when the draft day happens.
I think a great example of, the points you're illustrating there for me personally this year was Allen Robinson wasn't a guy, on my gut I'm looking for based on his draft price. I kind of wasn't going for. Then I had Evan Silva on not too long ago, and he was like, he's number 6 in my rankings. I think he could lead the league in receptions, and he laid out this really good case about how great he's been with crap QB play. So even if Nick Foles is marginally better, like, he lays out this great case, and I look at Matt Harmon's reception perception, and it's like, everywhere he's lighting it up, and he's just like, Allen Robinson really is a stud, and he really has been getting it done at a very high level. Why am I not? So it is that process of trusting the gut, but then also, finding those right shoulders to lean upon when you see a good take. In that sense, are there any other analysts that you always make sure you're checking in on their content, or guys that really help influence your opinions?
Well, you mentioned Silva. I think Silva is just one of the OGs in the fantasy football game. I always listen to the Establish the Run podcast. I think that's just really, you're going to get a ton of information listening to that. And Silva's just so concise and convicted in all of his opinions that I just like. I think if you're trying to get into fantasy, like try and emulate him, because he's really just good at what he does. Scott Barrett is one of my kind of confidants. I bounce a lot of questions off of him. All the guys really at Fantasy Points are awesome. So I would say those are kind of like my 2 go-tos off the top of my head. There's just so many guys in the industry though. Pat Doherty at Roto World, Ian Hartitz, who I think just moved over to PFF, and they're going to have some really great stuff this year, I think, from him. So yeah, I think those are the kind of guys that come to mind. But there's just a lot of really, really smart people in the industry. Matt Berry, obviously, and guys at ESPN. So yeah, I think Scott Barrett is probably like my first go-to whenever I have a question, though. I think I'm like hitting him up in the DMs like every day, pretty much.
He is absolutely fantastic. I've had him on the pod a couple times now. He was actually probably like the first like big name I ever like really landed with and connected with. And now I've had him on, I think 3-4 times, and it's always just an absolute blast. I mean, last year he got obviously Christian McCaffrey, he was like, he's got to be 1 overall. And then he got Mark Andrews on the pod. He nailed Lamar Jackson on our pod. It was just like, this guy, it was, if you picked every cheat code of the season, he somehow had them all. And a lot of them I unfortunately was off on. So that's why it was so nice to have him on and give those takes. He is awesome. All those guys you mentioned, all fantastic. I think that's what I've noticed about the space is as you get more and more involved in Twitter, there's just so many smart fantasy guys out there. I never realized it until I got involved in Twitter. It's wild. In terms of this season, obviously we're looking at probably one of the strangest off seasons maybe of all time. Obviously COVID-19. And there is of course, doomsday scenario we hope does not happen. Season's canceled. Who knows what way we're trending, the way baseball's going right now. But let's kind of take we're going to get 16 games. But are you adjusting for things with like rookies, players on new teams, new schemes, or do you still kind of just are going with it? How are you approaching COVID-19, I guess I should say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think ultimately, honestly, I haven't changed the process all that much because I think you can overthink it.
Yeah.
We don't really have any way to predict if guys are going to lose time during the season to COVID. I mean, I get it. It seems based on what's happening in baseball, it seems likely that teams are going to have to deal with outbreaks, in teams. So trying to predict who that's going to happen to, I think is impossible. I think if anything, maybe this season handcuffs are a little bit more important, especially for kind of like the foundational guys on your team. If you have a guy that comes down with COVID, 90 minutes before a game or whatever, you want to have sort of like a backup plan. So maybe that means you stop, go heavier on handcuffs this year than normals. I know handcuffs have kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, I think, over the last few years, but this might be the year to kind of like keep that in mind, just because there's going to be so many late scratches. You don't even have to have handcuffs, just guys that are one, COVID infection. It's crazy that we're even say right. To say that is just like weird, but if you have a guy come down with COVID, then he gets forced into action in the fantasy football world. That's something to keep in mind. But it's going to be a strange season. I really hope that, we actually saw the Saints yesterday talking about how they're going to do sort of their own mini bubble for training camp. I suspect that's the only way this season's going to work. If all teams, have to start doing that. I think the NFL probably was, this is getting off track, but the NFL probably was going into the season thinking, let's try and not have bubbles and we don't have to spend these millions and millions of dollars to do this. But based on what's happening in baseball, I think that teams are probably going to be like, okay, there's no way we can do this without bubbles. So we have to spend the money. So that's kind of just my thought.
I totally agree. It's I think Pat Thorman has the hashtag bubble or bust kind of trending with his content a lot, but it's true. I mean, we're seeing if baseball, one of the most spread out sports, no contact really between players, or very little compared to football. I mean, if that's having these cases and uprising, what is going to happen if there's no type of system like a bubble in place? And I get the logistical nightmare when you have bigger rosters, a longer season. Who knows what it could end up being, but you got to be hoping at least they're coming up with some sort of bubble type plan in different areas. Who knows how much faith we can have in Goodell to pull something like that off, but man,
it's going to be up to the teams to do it. I feel like.
Yeah. So. Right. That's what it seems like. But last couple here before we dive into, again, that double down fantasy bounce backs are, you talked about the type of analysts you like to check out and make sure you cross your rankings on and everything. Is there any type of analytics or stats, film, and or any other just fantasy tools that you really like to use to nail down your analysis?
So I feel like there's diminishing returns when it comes to diving too deep into stats, because at the end of the day, I mean, efficiency stats don't have a heavy correlation typically with most positions. They do actually correlate pretty well with quarterbacks, but I feel like you kind of know who the good quarterbacks are. Right. It's not hard to see if a quarterback is really efficient. So I don't try and, you don't try and put too much stock into it. You can definitely use efficiency stats like yards per route run as a popular one that kind of has shown some predictive power, that in order to kind of find breakout type guys, potentials, the guys that have done really well in limited opportunities, and they might have, more of a chance this year based on that success in the past. But I think ultimately, like, you're looking for the really basic stuff, targets, volume. And so I try not to I don't weight efficiency stats all that much. I do go to airyards.com a lot. I think that's just a really valuable resource. They also have like the weighted opportunity rating, which kind of, it weights targets plus yards and things like that. I think now I'm off the top of my head, I'm forgetting exactly how they do that, but basically it's like, it's a weighted opportunity rating where you can see guys that are going to be getting a lot of fantasy scoring opportunity, which is obviously really important. So, I just think my goal typically is to definitely look into the stats and have a good grasp of guys that are efficient with their opportunities. But at the end of the day, basic stuff like targets and yards and snaps even for running backs are really what you want. And so for me, I'm more looking to predict which guys are going to get the most volume. And that's basically the name of the game, is figuring out which guys are going to have a big part in their offense.
1,000%. If they're not on the field, they're not getting used. They're not going to rack up. It's as basic as it sounds. So looking for those stats that predict volume and predict valuable volume, as you're talking about with weighted opportunities, all makes perfect sense. I know Rich Rebar had a really good recent article talking about those weighted type of opportunities for receivers, where red zone versus 5-yard line targets, they all got like a different type of weight. So I do love that type of stuff too. And Barrett, who we talked about, bell cows who get receptions, and how like a reception's 3 times as much volume. So if you're predicting that type of volume as well. So I love that, looking for the stats that predict volume, and then also the most valuable type of volume is definitely, it sounds simple, but sometimes I agree. People just overcomplicate and look at, all these things that let's just kind of watch them play and who's going to be on the field getting the touches. I lean more that way as well. So now we're moving into that feature segment we've been previewing, the fantasy bounce backs, the double downs. We're going to check out some of the biggest disappointments from last year, either based on the hype they were getting and or the draft price you were paying for them, and then see if we're willing to kind of double down and hope they bounce back, or if we're just going to keep avoiding them and the pain they've caused us in that season. It didn't really get too much more painful than the Steelers last year with JuJu and James Conner. Hideous. 2 of the biggest busts, both were fringe first rounders. Connor's was pretty much a lock first rounder, RB7, 10th overall ADP last year. JuJu, wide receiver, 6th and 15th overall. They obviously underwhelmed. JuJu was the wide receiver, 61 in PPR points per game. Connor was just in and out all season, 8 full contests. RB18 in points per game wasn't bad, but if you had Connor as your first rounder, you probably didn't win your league. But now the price this year, Connor's going to 44th overall, the running back 22 according to Fantasy Pros. JuJu's a little more expensive, wide receiver 16 and 39 overall. How confident are you doubling back down on these guys, either both of them or just one versus the other? Why don't we just start with JuJu? Are you confident going back in on JuJu this year?
I am, yeah. I don't know if I'm necessarily like, he's not like a guy I need to leave the second round with necessarily, but if he's sitting there, I do think he's at a strong value, because I think just overall the Steelers offense is going to look way, way different this year. And that's the big thing. Obviously he's got that connection with Big Ben that we've seen in the past. He's done it before. He's still young. And I just think we saw a worst case scenario for the Steelers last year. It's like Big Ben, I think, went out in week 2 or week 1. I can't remember. Like, it was really early. And their offense went from, top 10 and top 5 offense to literally the worst offense in the NFL. So I think, I'm bullish on JuJu. I think there's going to be tons of volume there. I think that, getting Big Ben back in that offense is going to be huge for him. I guess my question is, how big of a dent is Deontay Johnson, potentially James Washington, going to make in his overall bottom line? But at the end of the day, I think JuJu's still like the clear number 1 there. And, I think right now he's a solid value where he's at.
I mean, the Big Ben case is obviously that played the major role with that. Of course, when you lose your quarterback who you had a great rapport with, my question is in addition to those, other wide receivers taking another step, is are we undervaluing? Are we not looking enough at Antonio Brown leaving and how the coverage shifted? And does that play a bigger role? You know, we've seen QB proof guys like Hopkins, 111 catches, 15, 21 yards, 11
Yeah.
TDs with Hoyer, Mallett, Yates, Whedon throwing him the fucking ball. I mean, that is just disgusting. And he still got it done at an elite level. To me, you know, James Washington had the same awful QB play, but still somehow had more yards per game than JuJu, their number one, supposedly. I don't know. Does that worry you at all? Like, is he a true bona fide alpha? That's my biggest worry, to be honest.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat, I think. Actually, I kind of played the devil's advocate a little bit on a recent podcast of ours where I was like, I basically said the same thing. Like, James Washington and Deontay Johnson, especially Deontay Johnson, people are really excited about Deontay Johnson.
Right.
You know, he's like one of these top sleeper candidates. And James Washington actually outscored Deontay Johnson like from week 10 on. So both of these guys have some real reason to have some hype, and we're like excited about what they did last year. And both of them kind of outplayed JuJu. So it's just like, I guess, you know, the quarterback question is a really important one, I think. You know, like, is he quarterback proof? But at the end of the day, like, he's getting his quarterback back.
We hope, at least, right?
In theory. Yeah, I think he will be. At least for part of the season. And, you know, I just think he's easily the best bet. He like there's a short list of NFL receivers who have done what JuJu's done, you know, at his age.
True.
So I think just overall it's easier to bet on him bouncing back than him. You know, I feel like there was just so many variables last year that kind of like held him down. But I do think he'll be back. I am bullish on him. But I think that's actually a very valid concern. It's something that I've been thinking about as well.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, there's the success rate of receivers who hit like JuJu did in his first 2 years is extremely high. Like it's almost always they have a very strong career if they produce that early at his age, the breakout, you know, age. There is definitely that case. The other thing I don't love about him is the price right now in terms of like you're going past, you know, DJ Moore, who seems to only be rising and rising. You're bypassing, according to Fantasy Pros, at least Odell Beckham, Calvin Ridley, Robinson, who I was talking about, like all guys I have even a whole tier above JuJu. So based on his price, I don't know. I don't see myself doubling down this year when I could have had one of those other guys. Or what I like to do most often is go bell cow, try to get locked in 3 with my first 3 rounds. To me, I haven't ended up with JuJu on any teams because of the either receivers going around him or my aim for the running backs there. And speaking of the running backs, a potential bell cow in that price range as well is James Conner, who we alluded to too. Mm-hmm. Do you think he bounces back now that Big Ben is returning, or are you not as willing to double down on him?
I mean, I think he is an even better value. Like, as you mentioned, he's right now on Fantasy Pros, his ADP is 40. So you can get him like, you know, that's a really solid value, especially for a guy who was a first rounder last year, you know, like top 8 guy. So we know he has talent. We know that he's got injury concerns, but I do think he's going to get the volume in that offense. I mean, it's just like the Steelers kind of, that's just their MO. You know, they did draft Anthony McFarland. I think he's a great, like we talked about it earlier, like he's a great sort of handcuff type option in case, you know, Connor has a bunch of injuries again this season. But I think if Connor is healthy, he's going to be the guy, and that offense is going to be so much better with Big Ben. I mean, we've seen the difference in the efficiency and overall effectiveness, scoring points that offenses have when a good quarterback is under center. So I think it's just like a rising tide raises all ships. Like, I just think with Big Ben back under center, that everybody in that offense, everybody that's a fantasy factor is going to have a better year. And Connor is sort of like one of the last, but like guys that's going to get a full workload that you can get kind of in that range. Like, I would rather have, like, if you want to play like the name game, I would way rather have Connor than David Johnson at this point. I'd take Connor over probably Melvin Gordon, David Montgomery. I think I might take Jonathan Taylor over Connor just because maybe that's more fun. But there's a lot more question marks around like his usage, I think, than Connor. So
Especially after that picture of, did you see that one from yesterday? Jonathan Taylor
God.
just looking like a D-end. Like,
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah, he's definitely like a freak of nature athlete. So it's going to be really fun to see him play.
I can't wait to watch him. But yes, I mean, all ships do rise. They go from the 5th scoring offense to the 27th, 26.8 points per game to 18.1. So certainly both guys could bounce back. I personally do like Connor as a better bet, just the price around him and the idea of getting that workhorse. I mean, even with the shit around him last year, in those 8 full games he did make it through, he averaged 17.4 points per game, which would have been the RB9 last year. And Tomlin's already come out and said, I'm a featured runner type of guy. We've obviously seen that play out between, Le'Veon Bell, Connor a year ago, but also D'Angelo Williams when he had those opportunities whenever Bell went out, he just got fed too. The averages were 24.6 opportunities. That's attempts and targets per game on average, regardless of who it was, and 22.4 fantasy points per game for his lead backs. And they on average finish at the running back 2.5 in fantasy. So, I mean, that's a pretty impressive rate. This guy was, Connor, a league winner, 75.9% chance at making your playoffs just 2 seasons ago when he lit it up. Of course, the price was part of that, but yeah, 4th, late 3rd, early 4th, that type of bell cow. I mean, we're going to talk about 2 other bounce back bell cows next. You mentioned one of them already. I like Connor as a double down much more than either of these guys. One of them was David Johnson, who you alluded to, often a top 5 pick, gets hit with some injuries. Obviously, we had that run as well where he just looks like he's got like a piano on his back, and now everybody is like, he's done, he's finished. But he goes to at least a good-looking situation in Houston at first glance with, Deshaun Watson, a solid overall offense and tons of available volume. So now that he's out of Arizona, you already kind of alluded to you'd rather have Connor. Are you willing to go into David Johnson at all, or do you not think not worth your double down time?
I don't think I'm going to have very much David Johnson if any this year. I just think, look, I acknowledge that the volume is going to matter, and Carlos Hyde had over 1,000 yards last season, and I don't think anyone's like really super excited about Carlos Hyde as a player anymore. So I think I acknowledge that he could have a very good amount of volume. He could rush for over 1,000 yards, but he's not a guy I'm really targeting. I don't know if the ceiling is there as much as people like want it to be. Duke Johnson is still in the picture. I know that he's been like the most disappointing fantasy player for a lot of people over the years. And I get that, but he might be the guy that kind of gets all the 3rd down work. He's a good receiver. I don't know if I necessarily trust David Johnson to play a full season in terms of staying healthy, just based on, he's had some issues with injuries in the last couple of seasons. So I don't know. He's just like not a guy I'm excited about drafting. He's one of those guys, like if he's there on the clock, I'm probably looking at like a receiver or something instead. I just, it obviously depends on how the draft goes. And if I really need a running back, maybe I'll go for him. But like I said, then I'd rather probably take a guy honestly, I'd probably take David Montgomery over David Johnson right now, just because I think they're both going to get a lot of volume. And I just trust Montgomery a little bit more. And that maybe kind of tells you everything I need to know about David Johnson is that like a guy who had a terrible rookie year, I still kind of trust him more. So, I'm just not taking a lot of David Johnson.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm fully with you on that one where maybe this is just the spite type of guy where I had him in, 4 out of 5 big leagues last year. And those guys that you're just like, I will never fucking take you again, no matter what, you bag of shit, like that type of guy. I have that going for me, but even if not, I don't know that the volume should be there. Bill O'Brien's been top 12 in rush attempts every single year. He's been with the Texans and top 5 in 3 of those 6 seasons as well. And he just doesn't throw to the running backs a ton, which is also such a huge part of fantasy volume. Again, 3 times as value as a target is to a running back as compared to a carry. 28th, 32nd, 28th, 11th, one decent season, but 26th. So, 5 out of 6 have been 26th or worse in terms of targets to the running back. And you said Duke Johnson there. So if they're splitting a small aerial pie for running backs between each other, it seems like unsexy type of volume to me. As good as Deshaun Watson is, I see that team just kind of being in a bunch of shootouts this year. The defense doesn't seem all that much improved to me. And I think it's going to be a nice Watson season. I'm just spited, and I just don't. I'm with you. Just the receivers go in there, McLaurin, or different breakout receivers. I feel so much better about, and just am excited to leave the draft with. What are we doing this for if we're not going to be excited about our teams? David Johnson excites me zero this year, despite all the volume he could get.
I would way rather wait around if I can and get DeAndre Swift or Cam Akers. I mean, honestly, like I'd be way more excited about either of those guys. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I don't see David Johnson offering a whole much more than like a Jordan Howard. I mean, I guess, obviously Houston's a way better offense, but I mean, it's the same type of player in my mind. I don't see him at this stage of the career. I know that might seem ridiculous to say, but Jordan Howard, if that offense takes the next step, you can get him also, 5 rounds later. If that's the type of running back, I'm just trying to bet on volume. Why not wait 5 rounds and get a guy like Jordan Howard and hope he pans out? There's too many upside receivers or, those tight ends that could take that next leap to where David Johnson's going. I don't know. I'm not going in at all. Another volume back too last year, 8th in touches, 7th in receptions around running backs, but still only finishes RB19 in points per game was Le'Veon Bell. He was routinely a first rounder, top 8 in almost every draft you do, on average the running back 6, and just was so meh all year. He's coming far cheaper now, 2020, 42nd overall and RB20, but I don't know. Do you sense any reason, or are you doubling down at all with him?
No. And I mean, honestly, it's less about Le'Veon Bell as a player, and it's more like I just don't trust Adam Gase to put him in a good situation. I think either their offense is going to be so bad that he's just going to be wildly inefficient again, in that offense, or they're going to like make him part of running back by committee type thing. And I apologize if you can hear some construction outside my house. They're
worries.
Digging a sewer trench outside my house right now. So anyways.
I love when that happens.
So we'll try and push through it. But yeah, I think, like just at this point, I'm just over Adam Gase as like, I'm avoiding pretty much anybody that's in that offense except for maybe Jamison Crowder or something, because I mean, we've just seen like so many guys leave the yoke of Adam Gase and all of a sudden become awesome in fantasy. And the opposite is true. Like when they're in his offense, it's just, I'm not going to take a risk on that. Like I actually think Le'Veon Bell is like probably properly priced at this point. Like you can get him where he is now. And that's like, you can feel fine about it. You're not reaching on him, I don't think. But, it's kind of the same discussion we had with David Johnson. Like, I'd just way rather take a different guy in that area. I'd way rather just kind of bank on like a potential breakout star than kind of have to go through the season and have Le'Veon Bell in my lineup. I don't know. It's just not somebody I'm going to be drafting.
I'm in the same boat too. Again, not doubling down at all. They also bring in, Gase special Frank Gore, who might be like 70 at this point, but still continues to just ball out. Even when he was with the 2018 Dolphins, those two were together, Gore and Gase. And 35-year-old Gore at the time, got 168 touches to Drake, who we've just seen break out once he left the Gase bubble with 173. They were within 5 touches of each other. He always mismanages his talent. Nobody in the locker room clearly respects him after all these comments from Jamal Adams leaving. Like, it's horrendous. I get they improved the line somewhat. I mean, what are you not going to be 29th? You'll be maybe 25th at the end of the year. It wasn't any huge moves or steps forward. They don't really add any offensive firepower that excites me. Brashad Perriman is a late round stab, intrigues me a little bit, but Robbie Anderson's now gone. So it's like, are you getting the poor man's version of Robbie Anderson to replace him? Denzel Mims, an intriguing talent, but nothing about the moves they made make me think the line or the offense as a whole takes a step up. Gase, as you already pointed out, a huge negative for anybody, including Le'Veon Bell. So I'm with you. Not going back in on Le'Veon Bell, not going back on David Johnson, especially AJ Brown or some of these exciting wide receivers. It's why I keep hammering running back, because there is that drop off to like, oh, now we're just going for volume guys that really don't excite us. I'd rather, if possible, if the right guys fall to me. I mean, now Clyde Edwards-Helaire never makes it out of round even 1 anymore. There was a time where he would kind of fall to the top of round 2 or the bottom round 2, early round 3. Now we're not getting that, sadly, but there's still, even Melvin Gordon sometimes in that range. Like, to me, there's definitely either a bell cow that would excite me more, or the wide receivers at that point just really, really bring
Yeah.
a lot more to the table, a lot more excitement. And I guess one last running back in that kind of like lumped in tier, but maybe more exciting. I don't know. Let's hear what you think about him. Todd Gurley, had a bad knee injury to end 2018, was a horrendous, just awful finish that drove down his price. I mean, for a guy that went back to back in a lot of fantasy scoring as the RB1, and then his price now, RB8, 14 overall, but still was a little bit of a disappointment even at that discounted price at the time. Finishes the RB16 in points per game, and now he's kind of fallen to that Le'Veon Bell range, 40 overall, running back 19 right now. Do you think, out of all these guys, do you think Gurley brings any more to the table? Do you see any upside doubling down with him, or is this just another one of those running backs to cross off the list?
I think, I would take Gurley over the guys that we just talked about. I think that the big thing for me is if he can get back to catching a lot of passes, which I think he can, there's just a lot of inherent value there. Like, I do think I do think his best days are behind him in terms of like his explosiveness. Just, it's a degenerative knee problem. It's a reality. It's something that he's going to have to deal with. He's on, I think, a 1-year deal. So the Falcons are, clearly not like trying to think long-term with Gurley. They just want to kind of like, get a experienced, good, versatile back in their backfield. And I think that's what he is. Like, he has that ability to catch passes. He could be used in the screen game. And, he's still finished, I believe he still finished as like a top 15 running back last year. I can't remember off the top of my head where he finished, but he, wasn't like this atrocious season. And that was with him barely catching any passes. So, I think the Falcons offense is going to be pretty good. I think they'll give him a lot of chances to score touchdowns in the red zone, just because, they're probably going to be playing in a lot of shootouts. Yes. So maybe he won't be racking up quite as many carries as you want, but he'll still have the opportunity to score, and I think he'll have the opportunity to catch some passes. So I do think he's a pretty solid value for where he is now, and he's the kind of guy I'd be willing to take. Yeah, he was the RB14 in PPR last year, so it's not like he just completely fell off the map. I see him as like a solid RB2.
Yeah, I think all those cases, especially the 1-year deal, like why not ride this guy? And who else are you going to ride instead of him? Who's behind? Smith, none of those guys. Yeah, exactly. So there's really no one that seems to be, in danger of forcing a committee. Tons of available volume. They lead the league in available targets, 261, and Freeman had 70 of those last year. So certainly some available passing game volume, which he could definitely shown it to be a great receiver throughout his career. 190 carries was the 5th most unaccounted carries for over half of their carries last year. So the volume is there. The contract's a great situation. I mean, the line, it should be better because the Rams just probably had the worst, run blocking line in the league, which was part of why he was so inefficient. There is the concerns about Dirk Cutter and his running backs, but it's been hit or miss. He really didn't have a ton to ride, and he had some positives with like Doug Martin having some bounce backs. Maurice Jones-Drew had huge years in Jacksonville under him. So, if he can stay healthy, obviously a huge gamble right now with the knee, but that's baked into the price. So he's one of the guys. I think I'd rather have James Conner. I'd probably rather double down on him first. But if Conner's gone, I'm certainly going to double down on Gurley before I go to some of those other guys that we've been talking about. That's kind of where I fall on this one. Now moving more to the wide receivers and some quarterbacks as well. Probably the biggest pairing that busted real hard was Baker Mayfield, who was selected on average as the quarterback 4. I had him at number 2 last year for my quarterback, so that was a complete face plant. I really expected that next huge breakout season and finishes.
We all did. I mean,
exactly. QB 20, QB 29 in PPR per game points. It was just a fiasco with Freddie Kitchens there. And then Odell, unsurprisingly, if Baker tanks that bad, his main target, Odell Beckham, also really tanked. Everybody all hyped up about him going and getting away from Eli Manning and unshackled. Goes at wide receiver 3, finishes as wide receiver 33 in points per game. What about these two? Do you think, in a new regime that they bounce back? Are you going to double down at all? Or is it still kind of a void for you?
I'm willing to double down. I'm especially I'm much more interested in Odell than Baker. I think if I'm taking a late round QB in like a 1 quarterback league, Baker's not necessarily the guy I'm targeting, but I do think I am bullish on both of these guys kind of bouncing back. I just think everything that could have kind of gone wrong for them last year did. Like you said, Freddie Kitchens, his offense was a disaster. It looked nothing like the offense that we saw in the second half of 2018 when Baker was like playing really, really well. I think Baker ended up really, really like forcing a lot of stuff. It was like he was playing like the Jameis Winston hero ball style thing where he actually had, I believe, 15 interceptions from clean pocket, which was second worst only to Jameis Winston last year. So it was clearly that he was just, to me, forcing it, or you're not seeing what he was supposed to be seeing. And I think that can kind of, especially when you kind of look at how well he played as a rookie, I think that kind of, you point to me, that points to like the scheme, the preparation, and the coaching and all that, because, you know, Baker's been a very accurate, good decision maker in college and as a rookie. So to me, I'm going kind of with just, there was so many issues with the offense, so many issues with the coaching staff, and then he ended up pressing a lot, and it just, the on-field product was just not good. So I think he, to me, is a strong candidate to bounce back next year. I'm not necessarily like seeing him as like a huge target for me, but I do think overall the offense is going to be better. I think that offense, at least that we think that Stefanski is going to run, kind of what they ran in Minnesota the year prior, where it's a lot of play action, a lot of run, like balanced, and then take some deep shots. I think that plays well into Mayfield's like skill set, where he's, like I said, he's not trying to be the hero. He's not trying to be the guy. He's just part of the system where he can kind of use his accuracy, use his talent in an effective way. So there's a lot of caveats here just because it's a new offense. It's a shortened off season. You know, there's so many kind of things that could go against this, but ultimately I do think that offense is going to be better. They have a good offensive line. They have two really good backs, and I think the scheme will be much better. And I think Stefanski will put him in situations where he's not being forced to press quite as much. So I think that will show up in his efficiency.
I totally agree with pretty much all these points right here. That I'm not really targeting Baker necessarily, but I could see him really bouncing back real life wise. I mean, the reason I don't necessarily want him in fantasy, it's a low volume pass attack if Stefanski does what he did last year, 30th in overall attempts. But the efficiency that spiked for Kirk Cousins, his best TD percentage of his career, best interception percentage of his career, best quarterback ranking of his career, and adjusted air yards per attempt. So they do kind of air it out when they finally do take to the air in that play action heavy, as you suggested. And that is one of Mayfield's strengths off play actions. Last year, he completed 66.5% of his passes with 11 TDs, 6 interceptions, not great, but 102.5, passer rating, which was just wildly further down, 11 TDs and 15 interceptions and a 68.8 ranking when not using play action last year and a 56% completion percentage. So he definitely is a better play action quarterback than he has historically performed better. So more of that certainly will play into his strengths. So I just need to see him, though. If I'm even going to consider him and any of these weapons, like, I got to see his face and see that chubby Baker face. Is it going to be trimmed down, and is he worked out, and is he shredded and back to like, I'm actually committed to football? Because there were some signs that this guy was just not taking the offseason seriously last year. And it clearly trickled down, and he said all the right things so far. I need to see what he looks like when he shows up to camp, because he definitely did not show too great. Odell, I'm on the fence on, because I would love to double down the talent. I mean, he's one of those guys, the opposite of David Johnson, where out of spite, I don't want to go back to him. He won me a bunch of leagues his rookie year. You hold those guys like in your fantasy heart, and you're like, I have to get him again. So I love Odell just for what he's done for me historically. I love the talent. I think he's a beast. I do worry about the volume. I mean, Stephon Diggs, also a great, talented guy. I think he was like 30th or something in targets. 94 targets was significantly low. He did get used really well down the field. I mean, led the league on deep ball yardage with 635 of them. All 6 of his TDs were on deep throws of 20-plus yards. So I think that all fits Odell really well. I just, the volume worries and these, like, lately the comments about him not being fully all in worry me slightly. But I'm like you. I would definitely be more willing to go in on Odell right now. Baker just doesn't really excite me for fantasy, even if he does have that real life bounce back. Another receiver, though, that I definitely am going in on as a double down candidate, and I think most people are, but that's Adam Thielen. He's selected last year, wide receiver 10, 24 overall. Gets slowed with injuries, wide receiver 45 in points per game, but still right now. And earlier in the offseason, I feel like we could get him a little bit cheaper. He's falling around 4 at times. Now he's going to mid-round 3. He's still the wide receiver 10 despite the down year. So it seems like most people are buying back in on him. Are you going to be one of them?
Yeah, he's like one of my big targets this season. I think especially with Diggs going to Buffalo, he's the guy there now in Minnesota. It's a low volume offense, but he's like the clear cut number one. Justin Jefferson, I think, is another very interesting sort of late round pick, just because I think he's really good. And I think he'll get volume as a rookie. But to me, that mind meld connection between Thielen and Cousins is going to be is a really good thing this year. Thielen was dealing with injuries all of last season. That was a huge, huge factor that obviously held him back. When you look at the previous 2 seasons, I think he was like the wide receiver 7 and the wide receiver 8. Like getting him last year as the wide receiver 10 almost felt like a value based on the previous couple seasons. But he got hurt, and that was a big, huge, factor in why he, didn't pan out as a fantasy player. So, I think assuming he stays healthy, he's going to have a huge year. He could be one of those few guys that ends up, getting 130 plus, targets just based on, even if, obviously it's a low volume passing offense, but if you're the guy, you're going to have the opportunities. So he's good deep down the field. He's a really good route runner. I think he's just, people are kind of forgetting about him. He's a good post type sleeper right now.
Yeah, I love all those points. I mean, especially even in that low volume scheme, Gary Kubiak, taking over for Stefanski, kind of influenced the offense all last year. But, I mean, he's typically peppered his number one guy, 1,000-yard receivers in 19 of 23 seasons, 131 targets for his number one in 17 of 23, 150 targets in 10 of those 23, and 90-plus catch paces in 12 of 23. So, I mean, definitely history's on the side volume-wise. A guy that I'm also looking to bounce back on and double down on, especially at his current price right now, is Brandin Cooks. He was, the wide receiver 16 last year, right at the end of round 3. Obviously, injuries and whatnot, just finishes horrendously at wide receiver 70. The first time, though, ever, he was below the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game, and now he's falling to 79 overall, the wide receiver 33. He's Deshaun Watson's number 1, and I mean, he's been so consistent despite how many different teams he's been on. It's just 1,000 yards almost routinely before last year, and I just love how he could potentially fit in here. He's not DeAndre Hopkins. He's not going to see that type of volume. But even if, he's that number 1 for Deshaun Watson, one of the best deep balls in the NFL, which is obviously what Cooks does. 5th in deep yardage last year, 2nd in deep TDs, 1st in Pro Football Focus's adjusted deep completion percentage. So the molding of these strengths seems to me to be a great fit. Maybe it's Will Fuller who takes it over, but who knows if he can stay on the field. I really like Cooks at that, 8th round or so price that he's kind of going at right here. Do you bounce back? Do you double down on Cooks, or what do you think of him?
I think you make really good points. I'm not personally super excited about Cooks, but I'm excited about Will Fuller, which I think is kind of the same deal. Like, both of these guys have injury situations that are concerning. Obviously, Cooks has had multiple concussions, so that is a serious thing that you have to keep in mind. If he has another concussion, he might miss significant time. So I think the same could be said about Will Fuller, who's battled all kinds of different injuries, can't really seem to stay healthy. But I think both guys, and I'm slightly higher on Fuller, but I think both are good values where they are, because they have that chance. It wouldn't be totally shocking to see either of these guys finish as a high-end wide receiver 2 or low-end wide receiver 1. Right. Fuller particularly is just one of those guys who scores points in bunches, and like you said, Deshaun Watson, not afraid to air it out. They're going to be in shootouts. So I think I would say I would probably give the analysis kind of the same analysis for both Will Fuller and Brandin Cooks, and that they're actually going really similar area in the 80s. Right now I see on Fantasy Pros, Cooks is wide receiver 35, Fuller 36 in PPR. Kind of depends on the list you look at, but yeah. So they're right there in the same range, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I would lean Fuller, but I wouldn't blame anyone for going with Cooks. Cooks actually has a much better track record in fantasy. So I think right now just the injury history is like really baked into both of those guys' price, but it makes a lot of sense. The volume is going to be there.
I think all that makes total sense. So I know we only have 5 minutes. I want to jump to the no-huddle offense. The only other two guys I had written down, you can just kind of say yes or no if you're going to double down back on them from last year. Aaron Rodgers, yes or no? You doubling back down?
No.
Curtis Samuel?
Yes, I like Curtis Samuel, actually. He had like his disparity between air yards and receiving yards was just absolutely ludicrous. So I think he's going to have some like positive aggression, have better quarterback play. Sounds like they might try and use him as like a running back a little bit. I just think he's just such a talented player that I think that's going to bear out in fantasy. He's a really good value.
Agreed on both. No on Rodgers and definitely on Curtis Samuel, especially at his price for all the points you mentioned. All righty, let's rip you real quick. If I had to cut it short, I'll cut it short. We got 20 gut reactions. All you got to do is give me the player. If there's any you expand upon, you're welcome to, but not necessary. I'm going to run you through the no-huddle offense. You ready?
All right.
After Christian McCaffrey, I'm switching this one as we go because everybody says Saquon. So after McCaffrey and Saquon, who should go at number 3 overall?
Oh, I'm going to go off the rails a little bit and go with Kamara.
The next Dalvin Cook or round 2 running back who's top 5 in 2021 will be?
Miles Sanders, I guess.
Do you have a favorite fantasy team name that you've either had or seen in the past?
I thought about this. The one that kind of came to my mind was my friends had one called Perfect Strangers. And I don't know why, but I think that's funny.
That is fantastic. I love a good player name pun that you haven't seen before. That's great.
Yeah.
What about the next Chris Godwin? Round 4 or 5 receiver who explodes into the elite will be?
Oh, that's a really tough one. I mean, I think, does A.J. Brown qualify for that area?
I'd say so. He falls to round 4 sometimes, yeah.
Or I'd say either A.J. This is my favorite 3 guys, A.J. McLaurin or D.K. Metcalf.
Love them all. 2020's Mark Andrews or breakout tight end will be?
Ooh, this one's fun. I'm going to say Sternberger, but I also think Will Dissly is like this random dark horse. Apparently, he's just Wolverine and can heal against any injury that he gets. So he's like on track for week 1. So, yeah.
Love that call. I actually just tweeted about him this morning. I love it. Do you have a most hated NFL player for fantasy-specific reasons?
Not really. The guy that I was going to mention is James Conner, just because there's a bad taste in my mouth from last year. But I don't think I don't hate him. I actually would take him again. But he ruined me in the Ringer Fantasy League last year, so I'm a little bitter.
Absolutely. If there's somehow another Lamar Jackson or Pat Mahomes, it would be?
I'm going Burrow because I think he could actually be a pretty good – he's like – Josh Allen as a runner. Like he's really athletic as a runner. Not as big, but I think he could be the kind of guy like scores 5-6 touchdowns with his feet too.
Really interesting. Which early rounder, first or second, is going to bust the hardest?
Ooh, that's a tough one. What do you feel about Mixon?
Interesting.
Speaking of the Bengals, I'm just a little I don't know if I really buy into the Mixon being like the top tier guy.
Really interesting. Who will you not leave those middle rounds, 5 through 6, without making sure you get blank?
That's a really good question. Let me take a look. Let's see here. Sorry, this is supposed to be lightning round, but I'm looking at 5 or 6. Oh, man. I mean, not to repeat, but McLaurin, the other guy that I want to
You can repeat. That's fine. Absolutely.
love McLaurin in that range. The other guy who I think is really undervalued is DeAndre Swift. I think people are forgetting how good he is. And, he was like a top, like DV guy, Devy, whatever you say it, for like years. And really until like a month, until basically the combine, he was basically the consensus number 1 guy in Dynasty. And then obviously his landing spot hurt him. But I don't think his landing spot is as bad as people think.
The next sophomore after A.J. Brown that you would take would be?
McLaurin or DK. Probably DK, just because I'm a Seahawks homer.
Love it. Alvin Kamara, James Conner, Eckler were all top 5 running backs that fell after round 7. If there was going to be one of those in 2020, it would be.
That one's really tough because there's not really guys that I like in that range. For that, maybe like this is a terrible answer, but like Ronald Jones, maybe because people think he sucks basically, and that's why he's fallen. But I think he could be the starter in Tampa Bay if he gets on Tom Brady's like good side. Watch out.
Love it. And 2 more here. I've got a few more I'd love to ask you, but I know you got to get going. After Michael Thomas or Devontae Adams, what should be the number 3 receiver in fantasy?
Tyreek.
And what is your boldest 2020 fantasy prediction? And just remind our listeners where they can connect and find your work.
Oh, shit. I did not pre-think this one. I'm actually going to say my Ronald Jones one is my boldest. Like
that is
Ronald
bold,
Jones
yeah.
being like a high-end RB2. How about that?
Very cool.
And then, you can find me at Ringer.com, at the Ringer Fantasy Football Show, the podcast. And then, check out the Ringer Fantasy Football Draft Guide.
It is fantastic, and it is 100% free. You're doing yourself a disservice if you don't check it out. Danny, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it, man.
No problem. Thank you.
All righty.